Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all. My name is Qiao Baisen, and you can call me Michael. I'm a student from Beijing Foreign Studies University and Qiao University. It's my privilege to attend this international conference and deliver a brief oral presentation. The topic for my speech is about the historiographical approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis. More specifically, I will mainly focus on and analyze the relevant patterns of historical interpretation concerning the settlement of this crisis, as well as the impact of irrational factors on its peaceful ending. Today, I'd like to divide my presentation into four parts. First is the introduction of my research. Second, it will be a brief evaluation of current historiographical explanation of the crisis. Third, I will further analyze the role of irrational factors using the example of the Soviet submarine incident. And the last, some conclusion we've got. Okay, let's come to the first part. 2022, this year marked the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the closest moment of the Cold War to nuclear war, the reasons for the peaceful settlement of this crisis are still highly debatable. The epistemological paradigm for it has gone through three periods: traditionalism, rationalism, and post-rationalism. In fact, academic analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis has become comprehensive, holistic, and focused more on historical details. The research approaches has also gradually shifted from a single-state rationality perspective to bureaucratic politics, organizational behavior, and individual rational approach. In recent years, research on psychology of leaders and the role of individual decision-makers seems to gradually become mainstream. But a few scholars have begun to trace the contingent and uncontrollable factors. In fact, the irrational factors in the peaceful ending of this crisis are still downplayed and underestimated. In view of this, my research seeks to refine the historical approaches related to the Cuban Missile Crisis and clarify the role of irrational factors in its peaceful ending. In my presentation, irrational factors are defined as contingent, uncontrollable, and irrational or emotional things that are beyond the control of human reason. The methodology of my research is mainly based on literature research and case analysis through the collection and review of a large number of primary and secondary sources. And I hope this study will provide guidance for future research methodologies on Cuban Missile Crisis and may also provide relevant reference on the stockpiling, deployment, and command of nuclear weapons by current nuclear powers. Next, please allow me to briefly summarize the existing approaches to the study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Due to the time constraints, I can only focus on the aspects where problems exist, but I can't give you the specific examples and reasons. And I would like to begin by addressing the flaws in the famous Allison's model. Compared to the common use of the state as a unified rational actor in the analysis of international relations, Allison summarizes and proposes the rational actor model, organizational process model, and bureaucratic politics model to explain Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, the latter two models were very innovative at the time and broadened the perspective of the study. There are still a large number of problems with the information available today. On the one hand, the organizational process model is not suitable to explain the peaceful end. This model treats the decision-making process as an organized activity, assuming that the various parties of government will distribute and act according to predetermined organizational process. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very rare nuclear incident, and the US and the USSR didn't have adequate standard operating process in place beforehand. So significant organizational change still occurs in the face of this major crisis. Moreover, in this crisis, US decision makers didn't choose between the options offered by the parties as the organizational process model assumes. And on the other hand, the bureaucratic politics model is also not very suitable or appropriate to interpret this terrible crisis. And the bureaucratic politics model sees events in diplomacy as a composite of bargains between political agency in government based on interests and objectives. While contrary to what the model suggests, during this crisis, American leaders may not have formed interest groups and defined their own interests and goals due to the time limitation. And for the Soviet Union, research suggests that the crisis was more like the result of Khrushchev's own personal decision making, which makes the politic bureaucratic model even less explanatory. And next, let's move to the rational actor models. And similar to Allison, some scholars have also moved away from viewing the state as a rational single actor and instead examine the rational choices made by actors within the state, such as Khrushchev and Kennedy in this crisis. However, until now, some of these scholars have still wrongly attributed the peaceful end of this crisis to the rationality and the calmness of these decision makers on one side or on both sides, and especially for the co-leaders and co-decision makers. Well, they just ignore the existence of the irrational emotional factors. And indeed, even the assumption of rationality for a single individual level rather than a whole state still has several flaws and problems. Because humans are not inherently rationally behave like machines and often influenced by some emotional things, especially in crisis. Evidence shows that it's difficult for individuals and for persons to react rationally because of the enormous stress as well as some fear and anxiety. So it is more likely for them to behave irrationally. The evidence shows that President Kennedy's irrational discourses and the emotional letter from Khrushchev have already proved this viewpoint. Therefore, even if certain irrational factors really play a very useful role at certain moments, the impact of some irrational factors, including the emotional things, should and can't be ignored. And then I'd like to talk about the leader-focused research and psychological analysis of decision-making in this crisis. In recent years, research on this crisis have focused more on these things, especially the psychological and emotional staffs of the top leaders, Khrushchev and Kennedy, in view of their important role in this event. However, I would say the approaches of this research have some shortcomings as well. And furthermore, the role of the leaders seems to be overemphasized, which alone should not be the sufficient condition to explain the peaceful resolution of this crisis. First, the psychological decision-making of leaders is very complicated and it can be influenced by numerous detailed factors such as personal experience, information assessed, environmental factors, contingency, and the discourses from other peoples. Due to the difficulty of considering all of the factors together, many studies just try to implement it by using one of two psychological approaches to analyze. While some seemingly minor but important factors in influencing the choice and the psychological changes of leaders are often just being ignored it and neglected. And it's these factors that can have a major impact on the psychology of decision making, such as the impact of Pearl Harbor event and the book The Guns of August on JFK and opera Boris Godunova in Bolshoi on Khrushchev. Once these factors are overlooked, the final conclusion of the research will be influenced greatly. And furthermore, I would say it is still important for co-leaders to completely control all the conditions and thus avoid irrational variables on the battleground. Firstly, the co-leadership doesn't have a real-time view of what is happening on the front line, and its recipient of information and convenience are just time-consuming, and sometimes it's very tend to be error-prone. And secondly, soldiers on the front line may ignore these instructions and act on their own stuffs. And thirdly, in reality, there are some irrational factors that are totally out of the control of the leadership, say some contingency and other certain unexpected situations. So let's come to the next section. Indeed, the variable development of some detailed irrational variables really matters, especially some of which that are beyond the control, as I have mentioned before. And the following part, I will further explore the influence of irrational factors using the case of some incidental acts of frontline soldiers during the Soviet submarine incident. The Soviet Union confidentially sent 4 diesel-powered submarines to Cuba during the US blockade in this crisis, and each of them equipped it with 1 nuclear torpedo. Initially, the inconsistencies in the authorization for the use of nuclear torpedoes created huge uncertainty in the development of this incident. One instruction reads that the nuclear weapon can be used in an emergency, while another instruction doesn't. Later, during the blockade, 3 Soviet submarines were spotted by US Navy forces, and the B-59 submarine was in the most serious situation. While the American Navy spotted this submarine, they tried to force B-59 to the surface by firing practice depth charges. But the sailors think that the submarine has been occurred and they have attacked. So at that time, the mariners lose the communication with Moscow and didn't know whether the war had started. This submarine was even seriously broken with the temperature up to 45 or 50 Celsius degrees, and the oxygen is rarely deficient. Many soldiers just falling like dominoes. At this circumstance, the captain became furious and considered using the nuclear weapons. He said, "We will die, but we will sink them all." But he finally gave up doing so. Indeed, I would say, without knowing why the war had broken out, the aim of the other side, and whether Moscow would authorize the use of nuclear torpedo at such a moment. The choice to launch or not launch a nuclear weapon present a very wide range of possibility, and the possibility of each scenario are just not known. So even from a completely rational perspective, no choice can be made. And even worse, with time emergency, the terrible condition, and even several physical discomfort, it was more impractical for the captain to formulate plans and make rational choices. And therefore, the submarine commanders should have made the final choice based on his intuition, and fortune. And luckily, it was just this key choice based on irrational factors made by frontier soldiers that prevented the B-59 from firing a nuclear torpedo, which directly inhibited the escalation of the two sides being even worse. And in fact, when the Soviet submarine used its nuclear torpedoes, the United States was bound to counterattack and possibly even wage a nuclear strike. And just as the very, very terrible things, you can find that the Irrational factors really matters here. And in retrospect, the choice of an uncertainty presence of the soldiers at the front line could have determined whether the entire Cuban crisis could have been resolved peacefully or not. Whereas the influence of leaders at that time are just, I can say, negligible. And finally, please allow me to make a very brief and short conclusion. First, the contemporary historiographical approach for this crisis, including Ellison's model of foreign policy making and the research of the psychological analysis, the leader central research, some other rational actor models are still flawed and probably existed. And moreover, the smooth development of irrational factors was really and very decisive in bringing the crisis into a peaceful end. In this respect, the Cuban Missile Crisis may be even closer to a nuclear war than what we've ever thought. So in future studies, scholars should continue to break away from the assumption of rational actors, whether states or individuals. They should pay more attention to details and irrational factors. And that's all for my presentation. And here come my references. And for time reasons, I have omitted some contents. And you can find more details and evidence in the paper of mine with the same title. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me. And here is my email address. And that's all. Thank you.